Three Weird World viewers have shared their personal experiences of a young spirit who seems unable to move on. Simone. Simone has seen ghosts since the age of 14 and shared this account with us. In April 2002, she and her husband were living in a flat in London, and on this particular day were moving to their new house. They were planning to keep the flat to turn into a gallery where Simone could sell her art. By 7 a.m, Simone's husband had left for work and she was sitting in bed when she heard the sound of a key turning in the main door. She assumed that her husband must have forgotten something and returned home to look for it. Then she heard footsteps coming from the wooden floor of the corridor leading to her room and was shocked to see a young man of around 20 years old entering her room. The young man seemed distraught and he walked up and down in front of her bed where she could see his face and body clearly. She describes the man as looking deeply sad as they communicated telepathically, and she understood that he was upset because she was leaving the house. He was rubbing his hands together and touching his head, then sat at the edge of the bed. Simone tried to reassure him that she would not be gone and would be working in the flat during the day. Then he disappeared. When her husband returned home, he was skeptical about her sighting. Simone had just employed a nanny for her children, so they decided that the nanny could sleep in the flat, and during the day she would come to the new house to care for them. The day after the family's move, the nanny arrived as Simone prepared to go to her old flat cum gallery. However, she looked unsettled, so Simone asked her if everything was okay and if she was comfortable on her first night at the flat. The nanny looked at Simone, trying to mutter a response, and Simone asked, "What happened? Did you see him?" The woman stared, looking totally shocked, and Simone's husband dropped his mug on the floor where it shattered. He finally believed her. Simone asked the nanny, "How old is he?" and she answered 20. He had come to see her in her room and was very sad. Simone asked her to be kind to the ghost as he seemed a gentle soul. When she went to the flat to work every day, she would sense his presence but never saw him again. One day she was feeling low because her business wasn't going well, and as soon as she sensed his presence in the room, she asked him to help her. Literally 10 minutes later, a mother from her kids' school, whom she hardly knew, called her and purchased a large order of her work. In another strange incident, one day her children and the nanny were out visiting a museum when she received a call from the house. She knew because the number was displayed on the phone, so she called the nanny just to be sure, and sure enough, she and the kids were at the museum. They later sold the flat and the ghost was never seen again. Jokingly at the settlement with the new owners, she whispered to her husband whether they should mention the ghost, but he vetoed the idea, fearing the transaction wouldn't go through. Jared. In the early 1980s, Jared moved into a kind of bed and breakfast house with evening meals. When the owner of the house sold it and moved away, Jared stayed on as it was still a very welcoming house. However, this was when things started happening. When Jared got home from work one night, the new owners told him that they could hear a boy calling for his mum, and her name as well. This occurred for a good hour every afternoon for 5 days, and in the second week it was still happening. The new owner asked Jared who the spirit was, and he told her that he believed it to be the previous owner's son who had passed away in a car crash when he was 13 or 14. Jared had been to school with him, had been a year ahead of him, and remembered him very well. The new owner claimed to be a white witch and tried to contact the spirit as she feared the boy would be stuck in the house forever due to his mother moving away. While she was aware of the occurrences, she could never see or communicate with him to help him, and a few years later she sold the property to her brother. Jared moved with her to her new boarding house, then in 1988 moved back into the original house. Immediately, the residents of the house started asking him questions about the boy shouting for his mum. He advised them not to interact with the spirit, which seemed to keep the house peaceful. However, one Christmas day, strange things occurred, such as the phone ringing repeatedly but silent when picked up. Then there were repeated knocks on the front door, but nobody was there. Gerard was sitting with another resident, Peter, who would answer the door with again no one there and no sight of anyone who would have gone past the front window. Gerard and Peter kept checking both front and back and could not see anybody go either way. Some months later, Gerard had arrived home from work at about 4:30 p.m. and was told that the phone in the kitchen had been ringing nearly all day. He unplugged the phone out of its socket and to his amazement it started ringing. Gerard answered the phone and asked the caller to stop playing around as they were scaring the other men in the house. Finally, he asked the landlord to attend, who told them that Telecom had been phone testing all day and he had forgotten to tell them the night before. When everybody had calmed down, he took Gerard outside and told him that he had actually had the phones disconnected that day. He also said that he knew who or what was playing these tricks, although he himself had never experienced anything when he lived there. Gerard then told him the story about Christmas Day and told him to ask his sister about the haunting. Gerard noticed that after that, the landlord would only ever stay inside the house for no longer than 10 minutes. As the months went on, Gerard sensed that the spirit was becoming agitated, as he believed that people living in the house may have been provoking it when he was at work. One night he was nodding off to sleep just after midnight when his bed started shaking violently. He turned and saw red eyes looking at him from inside his wardrobe. He then shouted the name of the previous landlady's son and told him to pack it in because he was tired and needed sleep. Then the eyes just vanished and he was able to go to sleep. Soon after, another resident came running down the stairs from the room where he had seen the red eyes. The terrified man was drained of colour and shaking, and when he finally calmed down, said that he had seen red eyes from inside the wardrobe. Gerard explained that he had experienced the same thing and said if it happened again to just tell the lad to go like he did. The room where the red eyes appeared had been the boy's parents' room. Matt. Around the year 2000, Matt was in his late 20s and living in Vancouver, Canada. He, a friend and her sister planned to go to Victoria on Vancouver Island for a weekend visit to friends. Their first stop, the house of two old friends and their small children. On the way there, his friend had warned him that their house was haunted, but at the time, Matt was a bit of a skeptic. His friend described how lights would go on and off, keys and other items would disappear and reappear in different places, and so on. On arrival, the hosts, who were friendly, down-to-earth people, confirmed that keys and things like glasses would move, and when an old chandelier-type light flickered a little, that was also attributed to the ghost. Matt was still sceptical, thinking dodgy electrics in the old house. As the place was small, he was to sleep on a kind of padded bench down the hallway. Come night time, with everyone retreating to their rooms, he hunkered down on his bench. A few seconds after all the lights had gone out, Matt quietly called out, "Night, guys." But when no reply came, he figured he had whispered too low for the others to hear and closed his eyes. A few seconds later, he heard a little voice say, "Good night." His friend's bed was at least 4 or 5 meters away, but this voice was literally like the speaker was right next to him. There was just no way it could have been his friend from so far down the hall, so he was totally dumbfounded. He called out his friend's name quietly, but again got no reply. It took him a while to fall asleep after that, but not because he was afraid at all, simply because he was feeling amazed at what might have just happened. In the morning, he asked the group if their ghost happened to be a little girl, and they all stared at him and smiled, with one of his hosts asking, "Yes, how did you know?" His friend said she hadn't called good night to him after turning off the light, the only conclusion being that the ghost had, his own now indisputable evidence of a haunting. Sadly, none of them had any idea who the ghost might have been. They just knew she was there and that they all lived there together happily.